Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining today's webinar session. James Scullen here from the Australia-China Business Council. I'm really looking forward to giving you some guidance today on how COVID-19 is affecting the education sector. Now, we understand a lot of ACBC members are doing it quite tough at the moment with the unprecedented situation. So we're looking forward to giving you as much insight and guidance as possible. So for that reason, we're looking at making the session as interactive as possible. So if you have a look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A tab at the bottom. Feel free to enter any questions at any time on the Q&A tab, and we'll try and answer those after we've heard from both of our speakers. You'll also see that there's a chat function. Please, we won't be checking the chat, but please just guide your questions to the Q&A section. Now, I should also remind you that today's session is being recorded. So if we have any issues with bandwidth or the feed at all, rest assured that you can find anything that you miss on the ACBC website next week when we upload the video. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to Rhett Miller. Rhett is the Consul for Commercial and the Trade Commissioner for Education, working out of the Australian Consul General in Shanghai usually, but now he's currently at Melbourne. Rhett, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and greetings everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, wherever you are. I know it's been a very difficult time for everyone, so we appreciate you making the time to hear a little bit more about our COVID-19 response from Austrade. So what's going to happen today is I'm going to give you a brief overview about where we're currently at with respect to the situation of COVID-19 as it relates to China and more broadly. And then I'll talk about some of the measures that we've put in place to respond to the crisis. And then I'll turn over to my colleague, Rebecca Hall, who will give you an understanding of some of the broader measures that are being taken by Austrade with regard to the response. And also an understanding of the future impact to the sector of the virus. So James, if we can just roll over then to the first slide, that would be terrific. Right, and then just on to the next one. Thank you. So in terms of the situation as it currently stands, obviously since the imposition of travel restrictions in China, there's been a very significant impact on Chinese student visa holders. So as at the 29th of March, some 38% of Chinese student visa holders remain outside of Australia. This is actually a reduced number relative to when the travel restriction was first applied to China on February 1. We went from something like 106,000 Chinese student visa holders outside of Australia on February 1, down to 67,000 student visa holders when the global travel ban was expanded on March 20. The reason for that is, of course, a lot of Chinese student visa holders entered Australia through a third country where they spent 14 days and then transited on to Australia. Other education markets have been somewhat less impacted by the travel restrictions. If you look at South Korea and Italy, for example, only 10% of student visa holders from those markets remain outside of Australia. And this is because the travel restrictions for those markets were applied later, meaning most of the students from those markets were already in Australia before the travel restrictions were applied. However, the story is, of course, an ever-changing one, and things are developing rapidly. And in relation to China, now many students are wanting to travel back to the market and have indeed travelled back to the market. We don't have statistics yet to hand as to how many students have in fact gone back to China. However, a survey that was conducted by the Beijing Overseas Student Agency Association found that 86% of students wanted to return home globally. And this is because China, as many of you have read in the media, is now being perceived as a safe haven. Things have definitely improved in the China market in relation to its education sector. You've seen schools in more remote provinces start to open up. So schools in places like Qinghai, Guizhou and Xinjiang. And indeed, a number of other provinces have already made announcements about future opening dates. But in saying that, there is still a way to go with the market returning to normal. Most schools on the eastern seaboard remain closed. And some of you might have read in the media that the Gaokao has now been delayed by 1 month through to July 7th and 8th, which will possibly have a big impact on the potential for semester 2 enrolments for providers going forward.
Rhett, if I just butt in there, for those students that have returned back to China, do we have data on whether they've deferred or, you know, at worst case scenario, whether any of them have actually cancelled their studies in Australia?
No, we don't have anything in relation to that. I mean, that's held at a provider level. However, in saying that, we've heard some positive news from certain group of 8 providers in relation to how many students, for example, have taken up online in the marketplace and kept their enrolment, which is good news. But we don't have any data in relation to that per se, given that it's a provider matter. Something that some people might not be aware of that's been lost in a lot of the white noise from the media in relation to this is that the Year 11 and 12 exemptions for entry to Australia for mainland Chinese students remain in place, even with the global border closure for Australia. So mainland Chinese students can, after undertaking a series of steps and getting permission from the Border Force Commissioner, enter Australia. That process is quite a lengthy one, and only a limited number of students have come through it to date. As I mentioned just before, the take-up of online has been quite significant from Chinese students. And I have to say, the adaptation of providers to delivery online has been quite impressive in the circumstances, and given they've had to do it in sort of record time, given the window they had with relation to semester 1 was very, very narrow. ANU, for example, has put some 700 programs online, and the University of Sydney around 1,000 programs. And as I mentioned before, a provider, I won't mention who they are, had indicated that of their Chinese enrolments, 80% had stated that they would continue to be enrolled and undertake online programs, which is a good sign. Some education providers have opted not to deliver online, and that includes one of the big ones, University of New South Wales, where they're offering deferral options to students. In UNSW's case, it has a trimester program. So it was looking at students potentially rolling over to that earlier second semester, which happens in June. But of course, as the crisis has progressed, that is looking very unlikely now. Institutions have been really impacted heavily also by the outbound travel restriction that's been applied to Australian citizens and permanent residents travelling overseas. So that's affected student exchange very severely, and also research, of course, with researchers not necessarily able to collaborate in conferences offshore. But thankfully, with online technology, a lot of that collaboration will still go on. Insurance, and James, if you can just roll over to the next slide, that'd be good. Insurance is emerging as an issue, particularly for the China market in relation to a lot of study tour providers who've of course been impacted by the announcement by the World Health Organization that this is a global pandemic, which means that bookings after that date are not necessarily covered for travel insurance. And China, as the largest study tour market, is significantly impacted by that. Our students who remain here in Australia are obviously facing great difficulties with regard to the current environment when it comes to employment. There is limited access to government support as it stands. There was some minor relief that some of you might have taken note of with respect to student visa working hours, the cap being lifted for those students in the aged care sector and working in the supermarket sector. However, beyond this, the relief is somewhat limited. So we're thinking about what we can do, particularly working with state and territories, to leverage support to students at what is a very, very difficult time. And that difficulty also extends to mental health, with so many students now in isolation, or alternately just dealing with the lockdown and being at home alone. There is a need to ensure that mental health services are extended to them if they do need to talk to someone during this time. One of the positives of what is happening at the moment is the fact that agents are adapting quite quickly as well to the current situation. So you've seen in the China market, and I think the China market's really been the leader on this, several agents switched to online fairs, and the Austrade has been quite involved in those fairs in terms of delivering virtual presentations on Study Australia to ensure we have brand continuity going forward. But as you would imagine, in the current environment, some institutions have now permanently closed in Australia, and there will be more to come. In particular, the English language market has been impacted first, and that is due to the fact that their programs tend to be shorter, and they have lower margins and quicker turnover of students, so their enrolments have dried up faster. The RTO sector will be also impacted going forward. We heard when the travel restrictions were applied that they had some 80% of their students already onshore. But by May, June, when their next intake comes into play, those enrolments will dry up. So it is a very difficult time for our providers, and it's important we work together as a sector to support one another through this. So if we could just roll on to the next slide, James. Thank you. So how have we responded as an agency? Well, Austrade's very much been focused as the aggregator of both information and support for international students and our education providers. For students, we have developed the Study Australia website, which provides a range of information on COVID-19 and support for them, as well as messages that are sent out on social media channels. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. For providers, we've developed a resource hub, as well as updates via our MIP, our market information package, which are weekly and come from our different posts around the world, so that providers have an understanding of the impact in different markets. We're also doing webinars such as the one taking place now, and recording those and placing those on our website. For everyone, for the whole sector, we have developed the hashtag In This Together call to action, which is a hashtag you can apply to any positive message you want to put out there on social media, including Weibo, and you can see there 通州公己, which is the hashtag for Weibo, to push those messages of supporting one another and positivity out into social media, so that people know that there is support and solidarity as we go through this difficult time. Austrade's also playing a role as the coordinator of comms for what's known as the Global Reputation Task Force, which was established by the International Education Council and the Education and Trade Minister for the purpose of guiding Australia's response to the reputation impact of the bushfires. But of course, things quickly turned to focusing on COVID-19. And we've been helpful in that body in terms of supporting the comms for the sector arising from its decisions. We're also working with the states and territories through Austrade's International Education Marketing Forum. That is a body that means that we can coordinate messages federally, which helps to provide a unity of message across the sector. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned our Study Australia website and those social media channels. They've been very focused on providing hard communication, so hard information to students about travel restrictions, health advice, and mental health support for our international student body. We've also got a list of links on that website to support and policies of individual education providers for students in relation to COVID-19. And we've included also on there links that were specific to the China market, because as you can imagine, at the beginning of the crisis, all that support was being directed towards Chinese students. Looking ahead, we'll be adding more material to that site focused on student welfare support, which I mentioned earlier is very important, given the difficulties our international student body faces, as well as more information on mental health too, coming from the states and territories. So if we just roll over to the next slide. You can just see there a snapshot of that website. And if we just roll over to the next one, James. So we've also been undertaking a range of reporting to that Global Reputation Task Force I mentioned earlier on social media that we're pushing out to the market. You can see there a variety of information in relation to our various social media posts. Our top performing Facebook post, for example, just this week was focused on announcements for last week was focused on announcements the interstate travel restrictions and travel restrictions more broadly. You've also got website visits by country, and Australia featuring very prominently there, showing that a lot of the focus of the site now is current students, information for current students. We just flick on to the next one. So we also have in place for the sector a Study Australia resource hub, and that's aimed at giving the sector the tools it needs to help maintain itself through this crisis. So one of the first things that we put in place on that hub was a referral list of online solution providers, which is a list of platform providers that can be used to deliver content. Specifically, we've got providers for the China market, but that will be expanded more broadly going forward. There's also an expression of interest form for any platform providers that would like to join that particular list for the sector. We've developed a guide for delivery of online content into the Chinese market, noting some of the challenges of delivering curriculum online into China. We've got a COVID-19 communications guide and resources, a resource that's specific for education agents, as well as recordings of webinars such as this one. Finally, we've got material on In This Together, that campaign, a guide of how to use that campaign and call to action, as well as assets attached to it, media that you can push out connected with it. Looking ahead with that resource hub, we'll be developing a referral list of virtual recruitment platform providers. And the idea behind that is, of course, going forward, it will be very challenging for providers to travel. So hence, virtual recruitment will likely become the norm for the coming months. And that resource will enable providers to digitally project themselves into different markets. We'll also have in place a guide for how to undertake virtual recruitment, as well as some digital assets to help providers in doing that. Finally, for agents, we'll put in place a regular agent webinar, and we had one just the other day, which had an enormous audience, showing the demand for agents when it comes to further information from government. We'll have an FAQ resource, as well as an open online survey tool for agents to be able to feed back on an ongoing basis any concerns they have to us, so they can be addressed. And just go to the next one, James. So I mentioned that In This Together campaign, 同舟共济 on Weibo. As of the 30th of March, the socialisation for that has been extremely good. We've got a total readership of 1.15 million, but we would encourage anyone who's listening today to further project that campaign by ensuring you use those hashtags on either Weibo or general social media in Australia, so that we can raise further awareness about the positive messages we want to send out. So James, I'll leave it there and then turn over to my colleague, Rebecca.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Rhett. I might just butt in there before Rebecca begins. Just a minor housekeeping issue. I see some people raising hands. If everyone could just direct their questions to the Q&A section. Rebecca's already been answering a few of those questions, and we'll see if Rhett can answer any of those during Rebecca's presentation, but anything we miss will come to at the end. So now I'd like to introduce Rebecca Hall, who is the Senior Industry Specialist for International Education at Austrade. Take it away, Rebecca.
Thanks a lot, James, and thanks, Rhett, for setting the scene so well. I just have a few slides here. I'm also here with my dog Tessa as well, holding her on my lap so she doesn't bark during the video conference. Can I thank ACBC for organising this webinar and to each of you for spending time today. I know there is a lot going on. We'll aim to spend just minutes with me and then leave heaps of time for questions. So many of you probably know Rhett, given your focus in China and the great work he's been doing there for us. I am our global lead onshore for Austrade and working with states and territories and many of you in international education. What I wanted to share was some of the broader work that we're leading as we look towards recovery. Of course, right now we are in very real and challenging times for our institutions, for our students, for our broader community and economy. But what I want to share with you on this first slide are basically nine areas that we had started to pivot our resources to, and by end of January had reconfigured our team so we could actually deliver on these goals. The first was really to knuckle down to prioritise our partnership with states and territories and pilot a new way of working with them to address shared marketing opportunities, research opportunities and consumer insights. And so we've been meeting on a weekly basis with that group. And we know that's been one of the challenges for Australia when we're engaging globally, and a great opportunity for us to show how we can respond during the crisis, uniting our efforts. That does link to the potential of Australia's new nation brand and how we might roll that out, obviously in due course and at the appropriate time. Digital has never been more important than now. And of course, COVID has been the ultimate digital disruptor. But as Rhett said, great to see how the sector's been responding. We are also trying to respond in terms of our own digital platform. Market intelligence and delivering more digital reporting and insights, key priority. Our events and transitioning to virtual events. And then the last three, moving to global campaigns, particularly how we implement in this together with you as user generated. I'm really excited about what we're calling our Study with Australia product diversification. So how we actually build on the great capability that Australia already has in delivering online, and how we can show students can engage with us. Now, this isn't necessarily for students who are here already. This will be a pilot to see how students offshore who perhaps haven't thought of Australia previously, and how we can show our expertise in online and micro-credentials. And of course, we're playing a key role, as Rhett mentioned, in crisis response management. We'll go to the next slide, James. Thank you. One of the things that we have been asked a lot about, and that we obviously are keeping an eye on, is how other major English-speaking destinations are managing through COVID-19. Of course, as we realise now, global student mobility has effectively ceased, although we know there are students here, students still in other countries that are potentially facing challenging times away from home. And so we are tracking, of course, how other major destinations are responding to this. And I know many of you are looking at policy responses in other countries as well, but also looking at the theme of the national response, if you like. And we've been working on this full time. I think the education sector obviously had an earlier view of this compared to some other sectors, given what we were working with in January. But for me, what I saw was an organic response from Australia and from our institutions that really prioritised and focused on caring for our students, collaborating, and bringing creativity to the task. And we hope that we can continue in that vein. I'll go to the next slide. One of the things that I have, we get asked a lot about at Austrade is our, how you as individual businesses may be eligible for the economic stimulus, and in particular, I know there are questions around how students will be supported during this time. So this slide is a very quick overview of some of the programs that have been announced by the Prime Minister and through the economic stimulus mechanism that a number of your businesses, I'm sure and would hope, are eligible for. I do draw your attention, of course, to the work that states and territories are delivering as well within their own stimulus packages, and the initial $1 billion that was set aside to support regions, communities and industries that have been disproportionately affected by the economic impacts of coronavirus. And indeed, for those of us in the education sector, we know that only too well. On the student side, of course, we have a number of questions from students, agents and institutions on determinations around students' eligibility for a range of announcements. Austrade is not the policy agency, but as Rhett mentioned, we are trying to get the right information into the right hands. And so sharing some of the positives here, I think, on this side around the moratorium on evictions announced for all renters, the role that our purpose-built student accommodation providers are providing. And I know the conversation in the media around opportunities for temporary workers, temporary migrants to also be considered. I think importantly though, our institutions and our states and territories and our community organisations are stepping up, and we're seeing great examples of support for students who may have, through no fault of their own, become vulnerable through this process. And that is changing on a regular aim to keep you up to date, and through many of those channels that Rhett mentioned earlier on. We'll go to the next slide, which I think is close to my final. Rhett's spoken about in this together, but I just wanted to flag, I think, one of the things that's been lovely about this this action is it's not a campaign, it's a movement, it's an organic way of us to come together. And what started out as a concept, reaching out to our peers in China, has really become something that I know many people in the sector are also resonating with. We know that our frontline workers, our teachers, administrators, those running our institutions, those turning courses online in a matter of weeks, that for them as well. And so we're keen to see how we can continue to unite under this call to action. So I'll finish on my final slide, and one of the things that we've been trying to do, or a new term that I have been taking on throughout this start of 2020, has been a bit of practical optimism, but also what are the simple things that we might be able to do to the right information and making the right decisions. So I thought I'd close on 6 simple steps that you could take following this webinar. So the first would be, of course, keeping in touch with colleagues like Rhett and other trade commissioners in the region, whether it's in Greater China or in other areas. Our teams are still online working hard for you. Webinars, I don't know about you, but I've never done more webinars in my life, but I'm also enjoying how much I can fit into a day and the new information that I'm gathering. We also love to hear from you about any topics of interest that may not be covered and how we could deliver on them. If you haven't seen the new app, the new Australia COVID-19 app, it's actually a really great resource which is being updated by the hour with shared content, and has become, as Rhett mentioned, we started off on our channels offering that, the harder information that is now being delivered by this aggregator like australia.gov.au, and we're moving to, I guess, translating that for what that looks like for international education and students specifically. Rhett mentioned the market information package, and you can subscribe to that for free. The resource hub But ultimately, really, I think the number one thing is please try and stay positive, keep supporting each other, and I do really believe we are all in this together. So, James, thanks. Hopefully, we've got plenty of time for questions as well.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thanks for that, Rebecca. Now, just before we move on to the Q&A, I've just devised a little poll here. And let me see. Okay, I might have to come back to that. Okay, so Rhett, I just wanted to ask you a question. Obviously, communication has been such an issue for everyone about COVID-19, and we've had so many federal government updates. Obviously, the way we communicate with our Chinese students in Australia is always quite challenging, just given the different platforms that Chinese students tend to be on. I used to be a teacher myself, and I remember that my students would be on Melbourne Today or Red Scarf or Sydney Today. And I was just wondering to what extent, if any, the Australian government tries to work within those organic Chinese language platforms here in Australia, or if at all.
Yeah, look, it's a very good question, James. Where we are, I think, very prolific is on Chinese social media. So the Embassy, the Department of Education, and Austrade all have Weibo platforms, which have very significant following. And Austrade also has a WeChat platform as well. And we have pushed out all the content that I mentioned in my presentation in regards to the hard information, as well as that In This Together campaign on those platforms. So certainly as quickly as possible, as when there was an announcement with relation to travel restrictions or health advice, we had that translated into Chinese and then pushed out via all those mediums simultaneously and consistently. So that's certainly been, I think, the main channels. And given, so many Chinese students, I think, through education agencies are potentially followers of those channels, and education agents themselves are followers of those channels. It was, I think, a useful conduit to get that information out. In saying that, as you rightly point out, in a time like this, where things are changing so rapidly and so much information is coming out, it is a challenge to get everything out. However, certainly I think the agencies have done their best to get information out to students through those different channels.
Great. All right, excellent. Thanks for that, Rhett. And Rebecca, if I could just ask you, I was just wondering if you could give us a sense of, if we can try and look 12 months down the track. There's obviously so much that universities and higher education providers have learnt in terms of digital offerings. And particularly when we think about online platforms that can function in China, I was just wondering if you could give us some insight on what do you think some of the takeaways for higher education providers will be 12 months down the track of kind of what we know now about online delivery, particularly with respect to China?
Yeah, great question, James. And I think that's, if we can look for silver linings, and I know that's part of our coping mechanism is to do that, I think how quickly we have seen institutions pivot. And I think how we'll be able to see, I hope, how well students have also been able to thrive in that environment. One of the things that I've noticed, and I've been working in international education for 20 years, is we tend to have this either or, it's face-to-face or it's online, and one is better than another. And I think what we're showing through this process as well is that online isn't an individual sitting in front of a computer on their own. Online is the enabler for us to deliver information, news, knowledge, and teaching and learning. And we've been able to stand up some pretty good systems or pilot some ideas. So the approach that we've been taking, even within Austrade as well, is to move fast. So we may not get it 100% right, but let's start with something. So let's pilot with an EdTech service provider. Let's trial something in this area. So I do think actually from a procurement process as well, I think there's been some innovation there in terms of trialling. What I'd love to see, and certainly this has been Austrade's broader strategy under AIE 2025, is a much more fluid approach to international education that of course welcomes as many students who are able to study here in Australia, but also enables much more freedom of movement to conduct that study anywhere you like, with probably the cloud being our biggest campus now for sure. I do think there's quite a bit of a big differential between our institutions and those who've been doing distance education because of the nature of the Australian geography and those who perhaps hadn't made those investments, but the ability to leapfrog and the ability to deliver good products and programs, I hope will mean that institutions will keep investing in it. We do get a lot of questions about, well, it's online, so I would like a discount. It's online, it should be cheaper. I think online, when it's done well, is not necessarily a cheaper option. It is about how we invest in the right technology, the right trainers, and I think it won't just be Australia who's having obviously experience and knowledge here, but we do have an opportunity ahead of some other competitors who I don't think had that. I think there was the question, not sure if it was this webinar or another, but what would be the Chinese government's view in online as well? And Rhett's probably better placed to talk about this, but obviously with domestic provision being delivered online in China, I'm sure that's opened up some lessons for them in terms of their policy decisions as well.
Yeah, sure. Rebecca, I'm happy to take that one. So look, when it comes to recognition of students' online study as a result of COVID-19, we're still waiting on the CSCSE to provide advice on its website in relation to that recognition, and they have indicated to us that that will be forthcoming. In saying that, if you look at China's own experience, where so many students have had to undertake online study due to the current situation, you had the MOE working with, I think it was 22 different MOOCs providers in China to ensure delivery of content to students. So they've certainly embraced online during this period. And, you know, hopefully that leads to, I think, greater recognition of online education in China into the future.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Rhett. Now, I managed to affix this poll, so I'm just going to launch a poll here, we have a lot of people from the sector on the call today, so we'd just like to gauge some sentiment about how people are feeling about the education sector's engagement with China going forward. So I'll release the results of that in about 10 minutes. But just coming to our questions. So the first one, the Chinese government is arranging extra flights to the UK to fly Chinese students back to China, especially students under 18. The same arrangements may also be set for students in the USA and Canada. If this also happens in Australia, it might have some negative impact on the student pipeline in the future and our reputation. Any update on if the Chinese embassy in Australia has plans to fly students back?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, James. So look, I'm not aware of anything to date, but I'm happy to take that on notice. Obviously, it's been really challenging now with the very restricted number of flights between Australia and China. And if you have a look at the bookings going forward, as I have actually in relation to myself potentially returning to post at the end of this month, they are all fully booked through to May. So there is obviously a lot of students heading back. And as I mentioned in my presentation, certainly from that poll that was conducted by the Beijing Agents Association, you have 86% of students globally saying that they would prefer to go back to China. So no doubt that exodus will continue. But we're not aware as to whether that's happening formally as a result of the Chinese embassy arranging flights.
James, I can answer that more broadly as well. Obviously, now that the situation is indeed global, any country's consular officials will be monitoring situations, and we've noticed a number of embassies in Australia who've reached out to try and identify their students or students in need. Under 18s, obviously, a very vulnerable group that have very unique needs in terms of guardianship, homestay and otherwise. But overall, we do get to see a few of those cases. Overall, things are progressing as well as they can, and we just included this week as well, if there is a serious consular case or an area that needs to be discussed, there are opportunities to connect with local embassies as well.
So there's just a similar question here from Michael Chen asking about whether China in the near future explicitly or implicitly may discourage overseas study. Rebecca, what do you think about that?
Oh, I want to give that one to Rhett first.
Look, this is a global crisis. And it is something I think which impacts us all. And I don't necessarily think the Chinese government would discourage offshore study once things improve and once we are past this. Of course, at the present time, as Rebecca mentioned, many countries are encouraging their citizens to return home, to access their own healthcare systems, and to be back in relative safety. But I think once we're past this, I'm hopeful that there wouldn't be any discouragement of studying offshore.
Again, I would take a broader look at that too, and on behalf of other countries as well. So I do think, Australia managing very well under the conditions, that our healthcare system is geared up as best as it can be. And I know this is something that you don't want to compare against other countries, but certainly if you look at the experiences that might be occurring in the US, and how the pandemic is managed there, we're actually having families who are saying, I would like my son or daughter to remain in Australia and to be safe there whilst we see this through. There's another related question there about the future of international education following COVID-19. And I do think, obviously, another related area is international education and the opportunity to travel and learn in another country is something that parents save for, that they plan for, that if we move into significant recession or face economic challenges, there will be potentially limited capital to fund international education. So that is a real consideration. It's also a consideration for how the virus continues to spread or be contained around the globe. Obviously, we're focused on major outbreaks at the moment, like what's happening in Europe or others. We haven't read much about Africa yet, but if we think about global movement of students, there is probably still quite a ways to go in terms of that impact more broadly. I think the best we can do here is to keep investing in the student experience, keep focused 570,000 international students that are here with us right now, and how we can deliver them the best support during these trying times.
I've just got a quick one here. What percentage of university students are made up of foreign students? So the numbers I have in front of me for China is that Chinese students make up 60% of higher education, and all sectors in education, the Chinese cohort make up 54%. Do either of you have a number for the percentage of international students that make up the general university numbers in Australia?
So it's certainly not 60% of students. For the overall sector, you're looking at 28%. But I'm happy to pass back the up-to-date figures to share after this.
Yeah, I think Rhett, I was reading the percentage of international students. What percentage are from China? So I think it was 60% of.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Probably have time just for a few more. VRQA has advised that exemption applications for Year 11 and 12 students has now closed. Will applications which have already been lodged still continue to be assessed, or have all ceased?
I did see that one, and I have taken a photo of it and sent it to our colleagues, because certainly at the federal level and those processes, the application is still, or the exemption is still open, but we'll have to come back and just check with you. So obviously, as each of you know, the secondary school regulators are different in state to state, and there are 3 states who've taken up the exemption opportunity. So we can get back to you on that one.
Okay, great. And probably just have time for this last one. The Deputy Director of CSCSE officially declared they will accredit online courses during COVID-19, but no word about the future. I think this is meant as a question. There is a video of this somewhere, perhaps on the CSCSE website. Rhett, do you maybe know about that?
Yeah, so as I said before, the CSCSE plans to put out a statement online on its website, which provides more detail about that recognition of programs that are undertaken during the crisis. So you'll need to look out for that going forward to get more detail as to that recognition. And we've certainly been in touch with the CSCSE to ask for that statement to be placed online.
Okay, fantastic, great. Well, I'm just going to end this poll, and I will now share the results with everyone. So that should come up that we have 51% of respondents saying they're cautious about the Australia education sector's engagement with China over the next 12 months, which I would say, considering all that's happened towards the beginning of the year, that's not a bad response. And definitely answers seem to be more in the optimistic than in the negative. Now, just before we sign off, I'd just like to share the screen. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, Rebecca and Rhett, can you see that on your screen there?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
You can.
Yeah, great. So obviously, you know, this the COVID-19 has been challenging for ACBC as an organisation ourselves, but we remain committed to delivering insight for our members. So a lot of that is going to be digital for the next few months. So just on the screen, you can see a few of the events we have coming up in New South Wales. Next week on coronavirus in the workplace, we have an event at ACBC Queensland on Australian survival and Chinese recovery. Victoria has an event on the 7th, Keeping Your Team Strong, Workplace Mental Health. We have a partnered event with Austrade Beijing next week on the impact on global supply chain logistics. And I'll be conducting a similar national briefing to this one next week on COVID-19 and tourism. So we have Andrew Hogg from Tourism Australia who'll be joining us, and that event will be promoted early next week. So look out for that. And we also have our ACBC 2020 member survey. So would like to hear so much more of your requests of what our members are looking for from ACBC towards the rest of the year and this challenging time. Okay, well, we're up at 5 o'clock Melbourne time, so I'd like to thank Rhett and Rebecca, both for your insight today and, you know, going through so many questions and such a thorough look at the landscape of where education is sitting with our engagement with China. Maybe we can do something like this in the next few months as the situation is so evolving. And would really just like to thank Austrade as well. We've had a real great collaborative relationship with Austrade over the last few months. And look forward to delivering more support to ACBC members going forward. Okay, so we'll sign off from this session today. This session will be uploaded onto the ACBC website next week. Thanks a lot for joining, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot, James.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rhett. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Tessa says bye.